The Rowe estate stood quiet in the winter of 1861, its timber frame blackened at the edges from an old chimney fire no one spoke about. Beyond the orchard, where no fruit had grown in 3 years, the south wing had been rebuilt into a place they called the birthing hall. It wasn't a hospital, it wasn't a home. It was something between. Girls arrived under darkness, some carried by wagon, others by whispers. They entered with stomachs heavy and hands shaking, but none of them left with the same weight. The building had no sign, no published record, no burial ground. Only the Rowes knew how many had passed through, and even they, it seemed, didn't want to count. Adeline Rowe had returned from war with hands too steady for comfort. She'd stitched men through screams and sawed limbs in quiet tents near Antietam, but she never spoke of it. Locals remembered her as kind, soft-voiced, and always alone. Her sister Celeste said Adeline believed in privacy as a form of mercy. When she opened the maternity hall, she told town officials that each birth would be accounted for by voice. And when pressed for written ledgers, she smiled and said, "Some truths don't survive paper." No official protested. Most were eager to ignore the women who arrived swollen and silent. No one asked where the children went. Adeline said the women took them. The women said otherwise. The hall was kept cool even in July, windows never sealed and heat rarely lit. Women were told it preserved the child's breath. One survivor, interviewed decades later, said her breath came out in fog, but the baby made none. She recalled the sound of water dripping inside the walls. Another said Adeline placed her newborn on a metal tray beside a lit lantern and whispered, "Let's see who speaks first." The lantern cracked that night, and the child was never seen again. A girl who labored for 26 hours remembered being blindfolded halfway through. When she asked why, Adeline responded calmly, "The soul forgets pain faster when it doesn't watch itself suffer." No nurse was ever hired. Only Adeline moved between the rooms, always with bare feet and gloves never stained. Her apron remained spotless even after difficult births. Some swore she changed it hourly. Others believed she never touched blood at all, that it was done by someone else in the rooms behind the wooden partition where no one but family went. A preacher's daughter remembered hearing 2 voices during her labor, one kind and instructive, the other humming a lullaby in a low, broken rhythm. When she awoke, her stomach was flat, her arms empty, and a silver weight rested on her chest. She was told it was a mourning token. The name etched on it was not hers. No birth certificates ever emerged. The town clerk later admitted he was instructed to file all Rowe deliveries under transfer status. The term had no meaning then. No one asked what was being transferred or where. When the state attempted an audit in 1874, they found no ledgers, no names, no graves. Only the oral testimonies of women who were told to forget. The building by then was colder than before. Walls lined with plaster felt damp in every season. A doctor who visited once said the birth rooms had no smell. Like nothing had ever happened there, he told his wife. Like something else had cleaned it too well. What unsettled most who passed through wasn't the pain, but the silence. Infants who cried too soon were taken quickly. Those who didn't were held longer, sometimes for hours, until the quiet grew heavy. Adeline told the women that babies who waited to cry were closer to heaven and needed extra time. She never said what happened to those who never cried at all. And when she died in 1893, her will named no descendants, no debts, and no possessions beyond one phrase. The voice carries farther than the grave, but only if someone is still listening. The journal was found wrapped in linen inside a rusted chimney flue during the demolition of the East Wing. Its pages were water-stained and warped, but the handwriting, small, exact, never hurried, had survived the damp. No name signed the cover, but inside the first page was a simple note. If no one listens, they'll do it again. The entries spanned just 18 months between 1872 and 1874. The writer described herself only once as an assistant to the mother who wears no children of her own. That mother was Adeline Rowe, and the assistant, though unnamed, had seen enough to understand the weight of silence. According to the journal, every infant was measured the same way, stripped bare, rubbed in a cold cloth soaked with vinegar, then placed on a polished brass scale. The scale sat beneath a skylight, its beam carved with the Latin phrase pondus est veritas. Weight is truth. No child was named at birth. Names, the assistant wrote, were seen as an indulgence and a luxury permitted only to the proven. Infants were labeled by weight, marked with a chalk number on the sole of the foot. The cribs in the birthing room bore no letters, only iron tags stamped 1 through 16. The highest number ever recorded was 14. The lowest often remained empty. The assistant described Adeline's fixation with the scale. She'd weigh a child 3 times, first at birth, then after the first feeding, then once more at the end of the day. If the infant had lost weight, the feeding would be delayed 12 hours. If the infant had gained more than expected, Adeline would cut the portion in half. The body must learn humility early, she allegedly told the assistant. Too much growth too soon is vanity. Pride comes before decay. One child, marked as number 9, gained nearly 3 ounces overnight. The next day, the entry reads simply, 9 removed, crib unfit, scale reset. No further mention of 9 appears in the journal. In one passage, the assistant describes the naming book Adeline kept in a drawer beside the weighing station. It was a leather-bound register, completely blank. When the assistant asked when it would be used, Adeline responded without looking up, "When one of them deserves a future." The drawer was kept locked. The key worn around Adeline's neck tied to a ribbon braided from gray infant hair. It was never removed. The midwife detailed procedures that blurred the line between medical care and punishment. Infants who flailed too often were wrapped in tight muslin and pinned to weighted cradles. Those who lay too still were placed near cracked windows to test their response to cold. One chilling entry described a child who wouldn't stop trembling. Adeline reportedly held the child above the scale and whispered, "Even the frightened must learn balance." The trembling stopped after that. The journal does not say whether the child survived the night. Some children were left in the weighing station for hours, watched only through a sliver in the wall, an opening no larger than a finger width. Adeline would sometimes hum while observing. The assistant wrote that the lullaby never had words, but always ended the same way. 3 short hums, followed by a long exhale. The same pattern echoed through the halls, even when no one could see her. The most unsettling entry in the journal is dated October 3, 1873. It describes a night when the scale arm refused to balance. The brass weight kept drifting left, no matter the child placed on it. After several attempts, Adeline ordered all cribs to be emptied. Each infant was reweighed in silence. At dawn, only 12 were returned to the nursery. The assistant never discovered what happened to the remaining 2. That morning, she found their chalk numbers, 7 and 13, scrubbed off the wall above their cribs. In the margin beside the entry, a faint note, "Unbalanced souls need rest deeper than dirt." No church records ever listed the births. No local registry bore a trace. The assistant fled the estate months later and never spoke publicly. But before she left, she hid the journal in the flue beneath the very hearth where Adeline had once told her, "The fire purifies what shame dares not." She never knew if anyone would find it, but she understood that weight, once taken, cannot be undone. And in a house where nothing was named, the silence itself carried the heaviest truth. They called her Number 11. She was born in the winter of 1872 when the Rowe estate had already stopped logging births and begun cataloging behaviors instead. The delivery was uneventful, no tearing, no screaming, no complications. But when the infant was placed on the brass scale, she opened her eyes and looked directly toward the skylight, unfazed by the cold light pouring down. She made no noise, not at first. Not later, not once. Adeline didn't send her to the nursery with the others. Instead, she was moved to the East Wing, an annex built originally for fever quarantine but now repurposed for what the journals called elongated observations. This wing had no windows, only a single vent in the ceiling that hissed warm air like a soft hush. The room she was placed in was lined with padded cloth soaked in vinegar and dried until stiff. No creaks, no echoes. Every sound died before it reached the walls. She was strapped to a restraint chair designed for surgical stillness, padded belts across the limbs, a cradled neck hold, and a velvet-lined jaw clamped to keep the tongue from curling in sleep. The girl grew, but not the way others did. Her muscles adapted to silence. Her lungs developed with no test of strength. The journals describe her as pliant in limb, firm in gaze, void of protest. She blinked, she fed, she followed movement with her eyes, but she never cried. No gurgles, no whines, no sudden jerks that signaled discomfort or need. The staff called her the Stone One when Adeline wasn't in earshot. But Adeline called her Promise. She told the assistant that this child was proof that some souls could be taught to live without burdening the world with sound. She said, "A silent child is a gift to the future. It asks nothing and leaves no scars." The assistant, who had already begun to fear her role in the estate's routines, described the girl's treatment in chilling detail. Each day she was fed warm milk through a cloth-wrapped spout to mute the sound of swallowing. Her diapers were changed with surgical tongs, hands never touching skin. Once a week, Adeline would carry a brass tuning fork into the room, strike it against the doorway, and hold it inches from the girl's chest. The child never flinched. On one occasion, they brought in a crying infant to test for mimicry. The infant was placed across from her for 13 minutes. The cries echoed. She stared blankly. Then the crying child was removed and never returned. By her 4th year, Number 11 had learned to walk, but only when guided. She never stepped forward on her own. The assistant recorded that her feet made no sound on the padded floor. Not even when she was startled by the sudden snap of a shutter. She simply stood still as if waiting to be judged. One night, during a thunderstorm, a bolt struck the orchard outside. The vent system briefly failed, allowing wind and rain to howl through the east wing. And then, she screamed. The sound was small at first, then sharper, then constant. The girl's body convulsed. She thrashed against the restraint bed. She bit her own tongue. She bled. The assistant reached for Adeline, who was already walking calmly down the hallway with a white cloth and a silver bell. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She entered the room, pressed the cloth to the girl's face, and rang the bell once. The next morning, the assistant was instructed to dig a shallow pit in the northern garden. No body was present. Only the jaw clamp now snapped and the velvet jaw cushion soaked through. A funeral hymn was played from the phonograph, a recording labeled for misguided grace. A new plant was placed above the soil, a willow sapling with trimmed roots. Years later, the assistant would say that it wasn't the scream that haunted her, but the quiet after. That once the child had proven she could cry, it no longer mattered that she had waited. In a house where silence was praised, the first noise she made was her death sentence. And for the first time, the staff held a burial for a girl whose voice had arrived too late. There was a room at the end of the west hallway where the floorboards bowed inward and the air smelled faintly of rosewater and rust. It wasn't marked on any blueprint of the Rowe estate, and yet every girl who passed through remembered it, though none of them remembered entering it willingly. The staff called it the nursing room, but survivors would later refer to it only as the cradle between. Inside stood the double crib, an elongated birthing cot carved from ashwood with a divider down the center and two sets of curved arms extending from opposite sides. One side bore velvet padding and smelled of lavender. The other was lined with thin leather straps and dried cloth spotted in brown. Adeline Rowe, ever composed and clean, oversaw the comforting. She spoke gently, her palms always warm, her voice level. She brushed brows, fed the bottle, pressed quiet kisses to hairless heads. Her sister Celeste, when she appeared, was the opposite in every way. Eyes deep-set, teeth crooked, movements abrupt and cold. She never wore shoes. Her fingernails were always stained. Most believed she was just a nurse, someone from town with no official title. No records ever proved she existed at all. Yet almost every girl described her, and more than one child, now grown and haunted, recalled being passed between the two. The assistant midwife in her hidden journal described the process as bithermic balance. Adeline believed that infants could be taught to regulate not only their bodies but their fates. One woman gives, one takes, she wrote. One teaches the world is soft, the other teaches it never was. The twins, as some called them, would alternate each night, passing infants back and forth over the crib divider. Celeste's methods were colder, glass siphons used for drawing blood from the scalp, fingertips, or the soft fold behind the ear. The process was called depletion. The glass tubes were shaped like swan necks, delicate and hollow. They hung from small hooks nailed to the ceiling beams. Celeste's hand never shook. She worked in total silence. No infant cried while Adeline held them. Most cried while Celeste did. Some stopped crying altogether before being returned. One survivor, interviewed in her 70s, said she remembered a burning sensation in her temples as a child. Like I was leaking from the inside, she said. But I never knew what was taken until I couldn't sleep near anyone for the rest of my life. Her medical records showed chronic anemia before age 5. She was never breastfed, never adopted. No known surname. Inside the double crib, the divider was removable. One former worker claimed that Adeline and Celeste would sometimes lower the center and place two infants side by side. Then they'd watch, waiting to see which infant moved toward the other and which turned away. The one who turned away was chosen for depletion. The logic, according to a handwritten note found decades later, was that self-preserving infants are burdened by inherited selfishness. The cure is reduction. The note was signed only with the letter C. Despite living and working within the same estate for decades, only Adeline Rowe ever appeared in tax filings, census books, or town rosters. Celeste was never named, not once. Photographs of the staff show a woman who might be her, a blurred figure near the back, eyes downcast, but officials later claimed it was a nurse from Montpellier. When questioned, Adeline once said, "Everyone has a shadow. Mine just stayed with me longer." She gave no other explanation. In 1887, the double crib was removed after a fire in the West Hall destroyed the roof above it. The room was sealed. No insurance claim was ever filed. During reconstruction, a worker found a velvet sachet tucked into the crib's drawer. Inside were two identical swan neck siphons, both stained dark, and a curl of infant hair tied in a red ribbon. No name was attached, no report was made. Years later, when the estate was reopened as a historical archive, the nursing room was rebranded as a linen storage space. But the bow in the floorboards remained, and some nights volunteers claimed the light fixtures above flickered in rhythm, once soft, once sharp, then nothing, as if something had been passed across the crib again. Something alive, something knowing, and something that never forgot which woman held it last. The cabinet was found wedged behind a false wall in the old pantry, sealed tight with 4 rusted locks and wrapped in a muslin cloth embroidered with infant initials no one recognized. Inside were procedural logs, each page brittle with age and bound by a red thread that had blackened at the edges. The ink bled in places, but the headings were clear: supplemental conditioning trials, 1875-1878. One entry was marked with a symbol instead of a title, a brass feeding dropper drawn in profile, flanked by 2 snowflake shapes. Beneath it, the line, "The milk must cool before the second feed." The entries detailed a method used only on select infants, those who were restless at rest or marse, according to Adeline's notations. It began with early morning feedings, a measured ounce of boiled milk delivered in absolute silence, followed by immediate removal of the child's clothing and placement into a regulation bath. The baths were metal basins lined with linen sheets soaked in salt water, each pre-packed with ice chiseled from the estate's cellar blocks. Infants were laid inside, fully exposed, arms restrained loosely at the sides, legs allowed only minor movement. The staff was instructed to remain quiet during the cooling phase. The child's lips were to be monitored for purpling. Once the color appeared, the infant was declared temperature-aware and removed. Some remained in the tub for 6 minutes, others longer. Once removed, the infant was dried without cloth, only warmed hands, bare and clean. Then, while still shivering, the child was fed the second portion of milk through a brass dropper. The milk, boiled again, was not allowed to cool naturally. It was to be delivered hot enough to test reflex, but not burn. The purpose was noted in one chilling passage: to teach the soul contradiction, to fear cold while trusting heat, to become loyal to discomfort. A surviving assistant who fled the estate in 1881 wrote anonymously to a local paper years later. She recalled that some infants, after multiple sessions, began to show signs of what she called body withdrawal, a refusal to reach, to grip, or to make eye contact. Their hands curled inward, their feet stopped kicking, their cries when they came were ragged and directionless, like a throat learning sound backwards. The assistant said one girl would hold her breath every time the brass dropper neared, not from pain but from instinct. She was later diagnosed with neurological tremors that never left her. No name was given, only her weight: 6 lbs, 2 Oz. The cooling tubs were stacked beneath the pantry stairs when not in use. The logs noted that ice quality was crucial. Cloudy ice caused emotional distortion in trials, while clear blocks yielded smoother recovery. The obsession with precision ran deep. Each feeding dropper had its own engraved number, and staff were instructed never to mix them. If one became tarnished, it was to be buried, not cleaned. Buried. Behind the estate, a small patch of soil near the north hedgerow was found to contain 12 brass droppers, unearthed by a gardener in 1932. No explanation followed, no report filed. What troubled those who later studied the logs wasn't just the act, but the language around it. The milk wasn't described as nourishment, it was instruction. The ice wasn't meant to soothe, it was the educator of reflex. Adeline believed the logs show that pain divided the spirit from the flesh in infancy, and that division built strength. She called it the row cleaving. No one knew how many underwent it. No one knows how many didn't survive. In later interviews, grown survivors of the estate described a strange fear of both baths and warmth. One man, born in 1877, said he could never sleep with blankets. His body rejected heat. Another woman recalled blacking out whenever milk touched her lips, even decades later. Doctors called it psychosomatic, she called it memory. By the time the cooling ritual was abandoned in the 1890s, the brass droppers had stopped arriving from their supplier. The estate claimed the method had been disproven, but deep in the logbook, a final note appears, unsigned but unmistakably Adeline's. Some lessons curdle in silence, but even spoiled milk teaches the tongue. By 1901, the nursery wing had not housed a living child in nearly a decade. The Rowe estate, now partially vacant and succumbing to rot, was undergoing a slow and reluctant restoration. The floors had warped from decades of winter damp, and the walls, once lined with bleached linen and painted murals of cherubs and trees, had yellowed to a sickly cream. When the restoration crew began peeling back the old plaster near the north-facing wall of the main nursery, they found something their contracts had not prepared them for. Beneath the surface layer was brick, newer than the house itself, red and dry, laid in a hasty, uneven pattern. Behind that, hollows, shallow niches carved crudely into the wall's foundation, and inside those spaces, 9 small skulls. Each skull sat curled in a fetal posture, the jawbones wired shut with copper filament. But that wasn't what stopped the workmen cold. Lodged beneath each mandible was a small brass disc, melted to bone, fused with heat or pressure. The discs bore no names, only numbers, each etched by hand in a child's script as though someone had been taught to write without paper. The numbers did not run in sequence, some were duplicated, some skipped entirely. One skull, smaller than the others, carried no disc at all, only a strip of velvet ribbon clenched between its teeth. When the estate's steward was called, he sent word to the surviving Rowe family members, who quickly arrived by carriage and halted all restoration. The explanation they offered was calm, rehearsed, and delivered with a chilling lack of pause. These were ancestral infant burials, they said, a common practice among early settler families to keep the spirits close. They claimed the skulls were part of a family tradition rooted in grief preservation and generational binding. They refused to allow removal or further investigation. The plaster was redone that same week. The workers were paid in full, then released from contract. Within a month, the restoration was called off entirely. But whispers circulated. One bricklayer, who later moved to Albany, claimed that when he touched the brass disc on the 7th skull, his thumb blistered. Another said he heard the faint clink of metal before any plaster had broken loose, like a weight swinging gently inside the wall. None of the men ever returned to the Rowe estate. Several later wrote unsigned letters to the local paper describing the scene in fragmented, nervous detail. None were published. A week after the incident, a city clerk who had been assigned to catalog the estate's archival materials reported that all files related to nursery procedures, staff rotations, and birth ledgers had vanished. Not misplaced, vanished. Cabinets emptied, logs removed, cross-reference numbers no longer existed. Even the inventory forms that had confirmed their presence days earlier were found to be blank. When questioned, the Rowe family said only this: "Children leave traces, but not all traces want to be found." A surviving midwife from the early 1880s living under a new name in New Hampshire came forward anonymously decades later. She claimed the skulls belonged to infants who weighed under worth, who were marked for silence from birth. She said that Adeline believed certain cries corrupted the air, that some infants were born carrying sick breath and could never be allowed to wail. Those were the ones she chose for stillness. The brass discs were not merely identifiers, they were silencers, heated and pressed beneath the tongue, then moved to the jaw once the body gave in. She claimed it was called mouth binding. No one had heard the term before. No one has since. No official report was filed, no coroner summoned. And when the house passed into public trust years later, that section of the nursery was painted over entirely. To this day, no restoration crew is allowed near the northern wall. The estate's tour guides are instructed never to mention it. But on cold mornings, when the plaster tightens and the pipes rattle behind the wall, some say you can still hear the metal discs shift slightly against the brick, like the sound of teeth grinding in a jaw that never learned how to open. They called him Elias Rowe, though no birth certificate ever proved the name. He was first seen publicly in 1886, a thin, pale child of about 8 years standing behind matriarch Adeline during the winter photograph taken in front of the estate's main doors. He didn't smile. He didn't squint at the sun. He simply stared forward, eyes fixed, mouth barely parted, as if waiting to be told whether he was alive or not. Town records listed him briefly as a ward of the family, destined to inherit the land, the house, the lineage. But those who encountered him privately whispered something else. The boy doesn't blink. Visitors described his presence as unbearable. He stood for hours in the same posture, hands clasped, never shifting his weight. His skin stayed cool even near the fire. When spoken to, he didn't respond, not even with a nod or tilt of the head. Some believed he was deaf or simple. Others said he was drugged. But the truth buried in the margins of Adeline's hidden documents was far worse. Elias was the final product of a long-forgotten regimen known only within the house as the Stillness Trials. The Stillness Trials began in 1879, targeting male infants with loud diaphragms and volatile eyelids. These children, once selected, were removed from the nursery rotation and placed into mirrored cradles, wrought iron bassinets lined with reflective panels on all interior surfaces. The goal, according to Adeline's journal, was to fracture the infant's sense of movement by flooding it with self. In these cradles, any gesture, blink, twitch, breath was returned to the child a dozen times over, warping the sense of self until the body began to fear its own motion. Infants were left in these cradles for hours. No cloth lined the metal. Instead, a thin salve was applied to their skin to prevent sores, described in the notes as mercurial softener. Most cried for days. Most failed the trial. But those who endured, who began to lie still, to quiet their breath, to stare, were advanced to phase 2, dosage. Laudanum was administered through a dropper precisely measured 3 times a day. The intent was not sedation, but calibration. Adeline believed that given early enough, the tincture could dull the muscles of expression without numbing cognition. The goal was the body's surrender, not the mind's. And Elias, for reasons no one would ever understand, did not resist. By 6 months old, he could hold a steady gaze for 10 full minutes without blinking. By 1 year, his tears dried up altogether. He no longer cried when wet, when cold, or when pierced by needle. He simply stared. As he aged, Elias was paraded before guests as proof of the Rowe family's control. Adeline insisted he was disciplined, refined, pure. He sat beside her during council dinners without shifting in his chair. When prompted to eat, he consumed exactly half of what was placed before him. When prompted to sleep, he lay flat and closed his eyes, but doctors later observed no REM movement. His body mimicked rest but never entered it. One guest remarked that Elias moved like a puppet that learned to breathe just enough to fool the room. In 1891, a physician from Hartford was brought in to examine him. The doctor's report, which surfaced years later in a private collection, stated that the boy suffers from irreversible autonomic restraint disorder, a condition never before documented. It noted that his blink reflex had ceased entirely. His vocal cords were functional, but no voluntary sound had ever been recorded. The doctor recommended immediate removal from the estate. He was never seen again. The Rose claimed Elias died of pneumonia the following spring. No grave was shown. No obituary was printed. But an entry in Adeline's final journal reads, "He held the world's gaze and never asked for its love. That is the purest air we could offer." When the estate was surveyed decades later, one of the mirrored cradles was discovered intact, stored in the attic beneath a tarpaulin. The glass was fogged with time, but one could still see the shape of restraint straps worn smooth by repetition. And etched into the metal frame, so faint it almost disappeared in light, was a single sentence. "Stillness is the price of remembrance." The book appeared without announcement in the back of a thrift shop in Barre, Vermont, nestled between two volumes on antique farming tools. It was tattered, its spine torn, its pages rippling with mildew. The cover bore no title, only a fingerprint smudged in something rust-colored and dried. The owner, a teenage clerk with no knowledge of provenance or value, listed it for 10 cents. It sat on the shelf for 2 days before a retired nurse named Lydia Wren picked it up and felt her hands tremble. She didn't know the name Celeste Rowe then, but she knew what a restraint drawing looked like, and she knew the shape of a silver clamp when she saw one sketched in precise, obsessive detail. The first page began without greeting. "This is not for record, this is for reflection." Beneath the line, a list, 42 entries, each marked with a symbol instead of a name. Some were numbers. Others were crude illustrations. A teardrop, a blade, a curled leaf. Every entry corresponded to a child. Every child had been tested. Celeste Rowe, the forgotten sister, the unlisted presence, had written in a thin, steady hand. Her voice throughout the book was clinical but disturbed, self-justifying and cold. She called the infants her instruments. She referred to her sessions not as trials, but studies in adaptation. The two behaviors she sought to refine were temperance and voiding instinct. Temperance was defined not as patience, but as the willing delay of physical desire in exchange for structure. Voiding instinct meant urination. Celeste believed infants who expelled waste before permission were creatures of chaos. Her methods to curb this were detailed across 3 chapters too disturbing to be mistaken for fiction. She used cloth-wrapped feeding tubes to force milk into the stomach slowly over hours, watching for signs of protest. If the infant cried or expelled the fluid, clamps were applied, not to silence them, but to teach delay. Silver-tipped clasps were attached to the thighs and jaws, then gradually tightened. One set was designed to tremble when muscles contracted. If a clamp shook, she wrote, "The body is speaking out of turn." Clamps that remained still for over 10 minutes were marked with a star. Most shocking were the pages devoted to what she called oral chastening. Infants who bit or chewed during feeding were fitted with soft leather gags wired shut at the corners, their tongues pinned beneath a mesh strip soaked in opium-laced oil. The book included hand-drawn diagrams of mouths pried open with metal wedges, lips trembling under strain. She recorded how long each child lasted before swallowing the fluid or choking on it. Some entries ended with the word returned, others with resisted. A few were simply crossed out. There were no names, no birth dates, no mention of where the children had gone. But each entry was accompanied by a short note on outcome integrity, Celeste's term for how well the body preserved stillness post-conditioning. The ones with poor scores, she said, were unfit to continue and offered back to hush. No one knew what offered back meant, but the phrase appeared again and again like a private ritual etched into the margins of horror. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the tone. Celeste never expressed guilt. Her writing was not frantic or ashamed. It was focused, proud. She believed what she was doing mattered. One line read, "Adeline prepares the spirit. I temper the vessel. We each tend the orchard in our own way." She signed it simply with a C. The book was taken to authorities but quietly dismissed as a hoax or private fiction. Too little evidence. Too much time passed. No records linked Celeste to a practicing medical license. No death certificate was ever found in her name. The book was shelved in a backroom evidence box and forgotten. Years later, a museum archivist recognized the style of drawing, particularly the distinctive looped lettering on the diagrams, and matched it to notes recovered from the Rowe estate in 1903. The handwriting was identical. To this day, Celeste's confession book remains one of the most disturbing unprosecuted documents in Vermont's private archives. No living survivor has claimed a symbol from the list. But among those who've studied it, one truth remains. The evil that hides behind care is the hardest to name, and the hands that soothe are sometimes the same ones that tighten the wire. The photograph was taken in late autumn of 1941, its edges curled and its surface silvered by time. It captured 11 children standing in a straight line against the hedgerow near the eastern field of the Rowe estate, each wearing the same oatmeal-colored linen tunic and leather boots. Their hair was trimmed identically, their arms stiff at their sides, their faces caught in that frozen space between obedience and something far older. Fear trained into stillness. It might have been dismissed as a strange family portrait if not for one boy, third from the right, whose tunic had slipped just enough to reveal the raw edge of a burn that curved along the base of his neck. At first glance, it seemed like a scar. Upon closer study, it was recent, raised, ridged, not yet faded. He was the only one in the photo with his mouth slightly open, and his eyes, not fixed like the others, were looking off frame, toward something that wasn't in the picture. The image was found decades later in a collection of estate memorabilia sold off during a bankruptcy settlement. A curator scanning for dates flagged the anomaly and sent it to a state forensic archivist. The findings were not conclusive but disturbing. The pattern of the injury aligned not with accidental scalding or sun exposure, but with a controlled thermal stimulus, specifically the kind applied using brass instruments heated over flame. The report noted a matching pattern to early sensory reflex experiments performed in wartime research. When questioned, the Rowe family offered only a one-line response: "Children must learn early where fire begins." The burn, it turned out, was not unique. Additional photographs uncovered from estate boxes revealed similar markings on other children. A girl with a seared line beneath her wrist, a boy with blistered palms half concealed by mittens. In each case, the marks were uniform in width, consistent with a rounded metal edge. None of the children were ever identified by name. None were found in school or census records. They appeared in photographs and estate logs only briefly, often described not as individuals but as test units. The logs, partially water-damaged but partially intact, referred to the program as thermal moral initiation. Adeline, or someone writing in her stead, believed that heat revealed the soul's readiness. "To flinch is to betray," one line reads. "To endure is to deserve." Infants deemed too sensitive were subjected to controlled heat exposure beginning as early as 6 months, first to the heel, then the palm, then the neck. Each child's response was logged under the column Reactivity Index. Those who flinched were moved to a different wing. Those who didn't were promoted as potential heirs. One chilling entry described a boy who cried before the instrument made contact. He was labeled anticipatory, a trait the Rowes found unacceptable. Anticipation, they wrote, led to rebellion. To guess pain before it arrived meant the child had imagined disobedience. The boy was removed from the program. The entry ends with a phrase repeated several times throughout the log. "Early fire leads to early silence." It wasn't discipline. It was measurement. Pain wasn't punishment, it was data. The children weren't being raised, they were being ranked. When investigators revisited the estate in the 1980s, the fireplace in the nursery's back room was still intact. Hidden behind the ash grate, wrapped in oilcloth, they found 3 instruments, curved brass rods, the length of a spoon handle, with grips wrapped in silk thread. Each bore a carved number 1, 2, 3. For varying temperatures, the archivist assumed. One rod had been scorched black. The others were tarnished but clean. They were sent for testing. The temperature retention capability was unmatched for instruments of their time. The Rowe descendants denied knowledge. They said the tools belonged to a hearthside game. They said the burn in the photo was from a cooking accident. They said all the children photographed had been adopted and placed safely, but none were ever located. No school admitted them. No gravestone bore their names. What the Rowes called discipline, others now understand as design, carefully orchestrated cruelty masquerading as correction. And what scars were visible, it turns out, were only the beginning. The deeper burns, the ones to the instinct, to trust, to the body's memory of safety, those remain long after skin grows back. Those children flinched too early, and for that, they were never forgiven. They were small, ornamental things, the bronze bells, barely wider than a child's palm, each affixed to the post of a crib by a curved iron hook. They made no noise on their own. There were no chimes through wind or movement. The cord to ring them hung loose, untouched, like a question never asked. Every crib in the Rowe nursery had one. But not every bell was ever heard. The rule, written into the private nursery protocols and whispered to the staff, was unambiguous. The bell may only ring once, and only when the child makes a sound worth keeping. Adeline had devised the rule herself long after the written ledgers had disappeared in the years when the estate operated by ritual more than record. She believed that an infant's voice was sacred but conditional, its value proven not by volume or desperation, but by tone, pitch, and what she called emotional purity. A cry that rang too shrill was ignored. A moan too weak was dismissed. Only the cries that struck something clean and resonant were acknowledged. And when such a cry occurred, the bell was to be rung once, then retired. The child would be marked for further attention. They might be named. They might be kept. But most bells were never touched. The staff, whether from fear or doubt, rarely invoked the rule. They stood over cribs in silence, listening to the discordant cries in the dark. Some infants screamed themselves into seizures. Others whimpered for days. Some never cried at all. No one was told which sounds were right. Only Adeline knew, and she would walk the halls barefoot at night, pausing at each bell, listening, breathing, waiting. She claimed she could tell by the shape of the silence what kind of soul slept beneath it. In the winter of 1892, an assistant named Miriam recorded a strange incident in the margins of her daily chart. Crib 9, she wrote, had housed a boy born underweight but responsive. He cried often, a high-pitched tremble that rose like steam. For 3 days, his bell remained untouched. On the 4th night, a sound echoed through the hallway, not the bell itself, but a sharp hiss followed by a low metallic snap. When Miriam entered, she found the crib empty and the bell twisted at its base. It had not rung. It had melted. The post was scorched where the hook had been. The cord was fused into a hard curl against the wood. No fire had been lit in the nursery that night. No candle overturned. When she reported it to Adeline, the matriarch only said, "Then he did not make a sound at all. He made a refusal." The next morning, the nameplate by Crib 9 was gone. A new child was placed there by dusk. Years later, during inventory, the melted bell was discovered wrapped in cloth and stored behind the nursery's chimney panel. the burn mark still curved along its rim. A forensic metallurgist brought in by archivists in the 1970s examined the piece and found evidence of extreme localized heat, too intense to come from standard flame, yet too precise to be accidental. Theories were proposed. None were proven. The bell remains in storage, its clapper still intact inside the warped frame, silent. Survivors from the estate, interviewed in adulthood, recalled the bells with unease. One woman said she learned to cry without sound, shaping her mouth in sobs but keeping her throat closed, hoping it would save her from judgment. Another said she had rung her own bell in secret one night and was punished for presumption. "The bell must come from another," Adeline had told her, "or it is only noise." The nursery's ceiling had once borne a mural of birds in flight, all painted in copper tones to match the bells. By the time the estate was closed, the mural had faded to ash, the paint flaked into the dust that lined the cribs. But the hooks still hung in place, and each one still held its bell, most pristine, some tarnished, all untouched. Except for one still burned black with no cord left to pull, a bell that never rang. Because the sound it waited for, the sound that might have saved the child beneath it, either never came or came too late to matter. When matriarch Miriam Dalton died in 1954, few mourned her publicly. She was the last direct bloodline steward of the Rowe estate, a gaunt, silent woman who never bore children but raised dozens behind the shuttered nursery doors. Her passing was listed in the local paper beneath the livestock auctions. No funeral was held. The house, shuttered for over a decade, remained untouched until county officials were authorized to inventory its contents. Among the clothing, decayed furniture, and rusted cradle hinges, they found a small velvet-wrapped object beneath the floorboards of Miriam's study. It was a prayer book, King James, hand-bound in cracked leather, but its margins told another story entirely. The verses had been rewritten, annotated in red ink with a steadiness that betrayed obsession. Nearly every psalm had been altered, words crossed out, lines rearranged, the gentle mercy of Scripture repurposed into instructions. The first alteration appeared in Psalm 88. The original line, "Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit," had been reworded in her hand to read, "Thou hast kept me from the first breath, and it was mercy." A chilling interpretation, one that framed silence as salvation. Psalm 131 meant to soothe. "Surely I have behaved and quieted myself as a child that is weaned of his mother," had been heavily marked. Beside it she wrote, "Wean by delay, delay by discipline. The lungs swell before the mind decays." The most disturbing entry came next to Psalm 39:2. "I was dumb with silence, and I held my peace." Miriam had underlined it 3 times and scrawled beside it, "Seal the soul in silence before it learns to scream." These were not prayers. They were blueprints. Officials found slips of paper tucked between the pages, some scraps of cloth, others crumbled notes dated only with numbers and initials. Several included phrases that repeated across the book. "The tongue is not holy at birth. Stillness is proximity to grace. Every cry is a step away from heaven." It became clear that Miriam Dalton did not just descend from Adeline. She inherited something far deeper, a belief system rooted in ritualized denial. But what Miriam added was doctrine. According to her marginalia, Miriam believed that every infant arrived earthside carrying the noise of their own damnation. The cry in her mind was not a sign of life. It was evidence of corruption, proof that the soul had been sullied by the journey into flesh. The prayer book revealed her purpose: to stall that fall. She believed that by pausing the first full breath, by delaying the lungs before their first scream, she could hold the infant closer to innocence, closer to God for just a moment longer. How she enacted this belief is suggested, though not confirmed. One annotation beside Psalm 22, which originally read, "Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring?" was crossed out entirely. In its place, "No help is needed before the roar. The silence is the sanctuary." It is believed that Miriam reintroduced breath restriction practices long after they had been outlawed in institutional settings. One note references the linen wrap, a method used in 19th century asylums to suppress spontaneous movement and, by extension, cries. Her version included the phrase, "cloth over cleft, then count to 6. Remove if no struggle." No official documentation of infant deaths during her tenure exists. But then again, no birth certificates were ever filed under her name either. In a sealed envelope inside the prayer book was a single photograph, an infant, no older than a few days, swaddled tightly and placed in what appeared to be a large pewter basin. No eyes visible, mouth open, a cloth just beginning to settle across the face. Written on the back, "Unbaptized, unspoiled." The prayer book was never published. It was deemed inadmissible as evidence in any inquiry, as Miriam had died and left no witnesses. It now sits in a sealed archive box, categorized under private religious deviations. But scholars who've studied it know what it is. It is not theology. It is the final piece of a lineage that taught suffering as silence and framed the absence of a cry as divine. Miriam Dalton didn't believe in comfort, she believed in containment. And her scripture was written not to be spoken aloud, but to make sure no one ever spoke again. It was late autumn when the trench was discovered, just past the first frost, when the soil held its shape like clay and refused to crumble. Workers clearing the barn's collapsed floorboards noticed a softened section near the eastern foundation. At first, they assumed it was animal damage, perhaps an old den or burrow, but the compactness of the earth was too uniform. Digging just 18 inches below the surface revealed something no one expected. A wooden hatch, reinforced with iron locked from beneath. When finally pried open, it released no scent of death, only cold. The air inside was dry and still, as if no breath had ever been allowed to linger. Inside there were no bodies, no bones, no decay. Only silence arranged into order. The trench stretched no more than 12 feet long and 3 feet wide, lined with a row of narrow wax-sealed coffins, 13 in total. Each was no larger than a child's crib, hand-carved and meticulously sealed with red wax along the seams. The lids bore no names, no dates, only a single marking. A wax circle with a diagonal line through the center, neither religious nor cultural but mechanical, as if it signified removal or erasure. When the coffins were opened under forensic supervision, what lay inside was worse than remains. Each container held a single folded piece of infant clothing, swaddles, bonnets, gowns, clean, pressed, and tucked into place like offerings. Resting atop each garment were 2 objects, a set of glass prosthetic eyes and a wax mold of an open infant mouth. The eyes varied in hue but shared the same unsettling quality, unnaturally bright, too polished for use, as if they had never seen anything at all. The wax mouths were more grotesque. Each one preserved the full impression of infant lips mid-cry, frozen in detail so precise that ridges and moisture lines were still visible. Some mouths appeared calm, others contorted in visible agony. But none were peaceful. Attached to the base of each wax mold was a tag, handwritten in fine script. Each tag bore the same chemical label: resin number 5, milk teeth formula. The formula's origin was unclear, but a page recovered from the old pantry shelf, tucked behind a loose jar of camphor oil, provided a hint. It detailed the creation of a resin made from boiled deciduous teeth, calcium scraped from breastbone, and tree sap used to fix the sound within the mold. The entry described a process in which the infant's mouth was gently pried open and the resin poured in while the child was still breathing. "Before the lungs decide," it read, "so the soul is shaped by what nearly escaped." No records exist to confirm which infants the molds belong to. None of the tags contained initials, weights, or markings linked to any surviving ledgers. But a map found folded in the base of one coffin showed a hand-drawn chart of the barn floor with the trench area marked "Holy Threshold." In the margin, a single line was written in what experts confirmed was Celeste Rose script. "Not every child needs to cross over to be counted. Some need only to almost arrive." Religious scholars later debated whether these objects represented a form of baptism, a ritual of symbolic preservation for infants not permitted to live. The positioning of the wax mouths, open as if mid-cry, and the untouched clothing beneath suggested something halfway between offering and artifact. The theory was horrifying, that these were not graves for the dead but for the sounds that should have been their first cries. One investigator noted a pattern. Of the 13 coffins, only 3 showed signs of aging or water damage. The others appeared almost preserved, as if opened and resealed many times. It was unclear why. Perhaps some were revisited, or perhaps the ritual wasn't complete until the sound had faded completely from the mold. A line found scribbled on the inside of the hatch door offered a final cryptic clue. "Cries stored too long turn brittle. They must be buried while they still shiver." The trench was resealed, the contents catalogued, boxed, and locked in state custody. No charges were filed. There was no official language for what had been done, no statute against the burial of almost sounds. But even now, those who stood near the opened hatch say they remember the feeling that the air wasn't just cold, but unfinished. That what had been buried there wasn't death, but something stranger, the imprint of a scream that had almost been born, and the terrible, calculated silence that came instead. When the Rowe estate was finally unsealed for public inquiry in 1997, it wasn't a scream that emerged. It was a whisper so old and cold that no one could quite trace its beginning. Archivists pieced together fragments from prayer books, intake logs, hand-sketched diagrams, and preservation drawers that should have held nothing but dust. But instead they found resin-laced mouths, weighted cloths, and number-tagged cradles that once carried children who never drew a legal breath. There were no names to charge, no living witnesses left to testify. But what surfaced was a truth too specific to ignore. A multi-generational practice of silent cruelty that had masqueraded as maternal care for over a century. The public response was slow at first. It didn't come with headlines or flashing sirens, but with quiet questions in hospitals and churches and county offices. Who signs for the body if there was no birth? Who confirms the baptism if the child never cries? Who accounts for silence when it's enforced before sound is ever possible? The Rowes had not just buried infants, they had buried procedures, erased methods, silenced every mechanism that could have offered protection. What remained was absence, and absence, when recorded enough times, becomes evidence. In November of that year, Vermont passed Emergency Bill 1197A, later renamed the Infant Safeguarding and Documentation Act. It required that all private baptisms, whether performed in homes, barns, sanctuaries, or family parlors, be registered with both the Department of Vital Records and the Office of Infant Health within 48 hours. Audio or video proof was mandated. Midwives and private caregivers were now legally obligated to submit biometric documentation, heel prints, hospital bands, weight stamps, before a newborn could be legally buried or transferred out of maternal custody. And for every out-of-hospital infant death, an autopsy was now required regardless of family preference or religious tradition. Opposition came quietly, from those who feared overreach, who claimed that tradition had been targeted. But the images were already burned into the public mind. Bells that had never rung, mouths wired before breath, silence recorded more meticulously than life. Legislators read the testimony from former assistants. One held up the melted bell from Crib 9 during floor arguments. It swung once in his grip, soundless. No one spoke against the bill again. That winter, the Roe land was officially designated as a historical violation site. It could not be sold. It could not be built upon. And in the northern field, where frost still clung to the roots of what used to be orchard trees, a monument was built. Simple, blunt. A stone wall no higher than a child's chest, with no dates carved and no names listed. Only a single iron plate sealed against rain and snow, engraved with a single line. Some cries were heard too late. Families came not to grieve someone they knew, but someone they suspected might have once existed. A great-aunt's lost pregnancy, a grandmother's missing sibling, a twin no one spoke of. People left pacifiers, worn photographs, sometimes just silence. The Roe family name was never tried. No court ruling declared guilt. But the laws changed anyway. And across the country, other states followed. It became harder to erase an infant in plain sight. Harder, not impossible. And still, beneath it all, remains the question that can't be legislated. How long can a silence last before it starts to sound like tradition? The Roe estate may never answer, but the ground beneath the monument holds a record more permanent than ledgers ever could. It remembers everything that was buried without breath. They found the letter by accident, misfiled in a stack of water-damaged courthouse records, wedged between a birth certificate from 1943 and a deed transfer marked void. It wasn't typed. It wasn't dated. It had no signature, no envelope. Just 7 creased lines written in graphite on old state stationery, folded twice and tucked deep enough that it might never have surfaced if not for a preservation intern scanning routine materials. It read, "Not every death is loud. Some are dried clean first. Some are swallowed by quiet hands in quiet rooms where bells never ring. Some are unwrapped but never named. Not every scream is made with sound. Some are made with silence that bruises from the inside out. You won't find them unless you know where to listen, and even then you might only hear your own breathing." The letter was authenticated by handwriting analysts, who determined it was not written by any of the known Roes. But the paper dated back to 1953, and the graphite matched a pencil brand distributed to state midwives during the same decade. The archivist labeled it Anonymous 14 and added it to the Roe exhibit's restricted file. But its words, those 7 lines, would come to shape the final voiceover of the documentary's closing chapter. There were no children left to interview, no remains left to exhume. The final resting places of those unnamed, unscreamed infants had long since been sealed, scattered, or burned with the floorboards that once held them. But what lingered as the research came to an end was something more elusive than fact. The haunting realization that the worst kinds of harm leave nothing to mourn. No body, no photograph, no date, no word. Just the memory of a sound that should have been there. The narrator reads slowly. Not every death is loud. And then silence. The screen fades to images of rusted feeding clamps, folded gowns beneath glass, the melted bronze bell fused to crib post. These artifacts, once hidden in sealed cabinets and earth-packed trenches, now rest in climate-controlled archives under locked access. They cannot be touched. They cannot be named. They are fragments of a violence too quiet for the courts and too methodical for history books. The final question posed to the audience is not one of justice, but of belief. What does it mean to erase pain so completely that not even a cry survives? What happens to grief that has no language? Can we mourn a life never recorded, a mouth never opened, a soul never screamed into the world? What the Rowe family did, through ritual, silence, obedience, and manipulation, was create a system where harm was never heard and therefore never seen. It wasn't a massacre, it wasn't a headline. It was a series of careful omissions. A devotion to stillness disguised as sanctity. A belief passed from one woman to another like a hymnal rewritten in the margins of Scripture. And that's what makes it dangerous. Not that it happened once, but that it could happen again, quietly, cleanly, without a trace. The screen fades to black. A bell rings. Once, then nothing. What do you think? Could this happen again? Would we hear it in time?